There is a question so simple, yet so disruptive, that when people first hear it, something inside them freezes. If the Federal Reserve can create money out of nothing, literally typing trillions into existence on a computer, then who exactly do they owe it to? How can something born from emptiness be a debt? And if every dollar in your pocket reads, Federal Reserve note, a promise to pay, then who is promising what, and to whom? The original question is almost childlike. The answer is anything but. Most people imagine money being printed by factories, backed by vaults of gold, or supported by some tangible reservoir of national wealth. But in 2020 and 2021, the Federal Reserve created $6 trillion without mining anything, without taxing anyone, without borrowing from any nation or any person. No gold changed hands. No deposits were made. No one gave the Fed $6 trillion. The numbers simply appeared born in silence, the way a magician pulls a dove from an empty sleeve. And yet every one of those dollars is technically debt. Debt that someone, somewhere, supposedly owes. This is the first fracture in the illusion. Because if the Fed created money without borrowing it, there is no creditor. The Fed owes no one. But the government, your government, owes the Fed. And not just the principal, but interest. Forever. The Federal Reserve creates money that costs them nothing, lends it to the United States government, and then collects interest payments funded by you through your taxes. Taxes that pay for a debt created from nothing. This is the hidden architecture of the American financial system, a structure built quietly behind closed doors for over a century. A structure designed not to stabilize the economy, as the textbooks tell you, but to transfer wealth upward $1, one tax payment, one generation at a time. To understand how the scam works, you first have to understand what the Federal Reserve actually is, and everything you think you know is wrong. Most Americans assume the Federal Reserve is a government agency. It sounds like one. Federal Reserve sits comfortably next to Federal Bureau of Investigation. But the Federal Reserve is not federal. It is not a department of the United States government. It is a private banking cartel designed by bankers for bankers, passed into law in 1913 after one of the most aggressive lobbying campaigns in U.S. history. Its structure is simple, once you strip away the smoke. There are 12 regional Federal Reserve banks: New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, Philadelphia, and others. Each one is a private corporation, not a government body. Each one has shareholders, and those shareholders are not citizens, not taxpayers, not the government. They are private commercial banks. J.P. Morgan Chase, Citibank, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley. These banks don't just interact with the Federal Reserve, they own it. They own shares in their regional Fed banks, they elect the majority of their directors, and they receive guaranteed dividends every year, 6%, by law. Even when the economy crashes, even when you lose your job, even when GDP collapses, the banks always collect. And at the top sits the Board of Governors in Washington, appointed by the President. Their presence creates the illusion of government oversight, like a carefully placed prop in a stage play. But the real machinery, the money creation, the asset holdings, the open market operations, all of that happens inside the regional banks, which are owned by private interests. The government sets the rules, but the banks run the house. This hybrid creature, half public mask, half private beast, is unique in American history, and it didn't happen by accident. In 1913, after a wave of financial panics, especially the Panic of 1907, the wealthiest banking dynasties in America seized their chance. Behind closed doors on Jekyll Island, men representing the Morgans, the Rockefellers, and the Rothschilds drafted the blueprint for the Federal Reserve. They sold it to Congress as a cure for instability, a way to protect the public. But privately, they knew the truth. Whoever controls the money supply controls everything else: the banks, the economy, and eventually the government itself. Before 1913, the U.S. government could create its own money. After 1913, it had to borrow money from the Federal Reserve, which created that money out of nothing and then charged interest on it. Control of the money supply shifted from the public to private hands. The greatest transfer of power in American history happened quietly, legally, and permanently. Which brings us back to the question, how does the Fed create money, and how does this creation turn into national debt? The mechanics are deceptively simple. Suppose Congress needs to spend $5 trillion but collects only $3 trillion in taxes. There is a $2 trillion shortfall. The Treasury issues bonds, IOUs, promising repayment with interest. Those bonds are sold at auction to foreign governments, pension funds, investment firms, and, crucially, the Federal Reserve. When the Fed decides to buy, say, $500 billion worth of those bonds, no money changes hands. There is no vault to open, no gold to transfer, no account to deduct from. A Fed official simply types numbers into a computer, and the Treasury's account increases by $500 billion. The money didn't move, it materialized. This is not metaphor, this is literal. With this new money, the government pays employees, funds programs, pays contractors, money enters the economy, but the government now owes the Fed $500 billion plus interest. And where do interest payments come from? Taxes. Your taxes. Every year, over $1 trillion in tax revenue is spent not on roads, schools, healthcare, or defense, but on interest payments on the national debt. Interest that flows in part to the Federal Reserve, and from the Fed to the private banks that own shares in it. Money created from nothing, earning real interest from you forever. And this system has operated quietly and relentlessly for over 100 years. But the deeper you follow the money, the more surreal the picture becomes. Because the Federal Reserve is not just creating money and collecting interest. It is embedded inside a circular system, a loop so elegantly engineered that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The regional Federal Reserve banks, owned by private commercial banks, elect 2/3 of their own directors. Those directors choose the presidents of their regional Fed banks. Those presidents sit on the Federal Open Market Committee, the group that decides how much money gets created, when interest rates rise or fall, and which assets the Fed buys. In other words, private banks help choose the people who control the levers that determine how much money flows into the economy, how expensive credit becomes, and how much profit banks will make. A system that appears regulated by the government is, from the inside, shaped by the very institutions it supposedly oversees, and the ownership details who owns how many shares are intentionally hidden. The Fed does not publish shareholder lists. It does not disclose voting power. But based on size and board representation, we know the biggest banks hold the biggest influence. And influence, not transparency, is the true currency of this system. The Federal Reserve operates like a lighthouse built by private ship owners illuminating the sea, yes, but always casting its brightest beam where it benefits its creators most. And because the banks receive a guaranteed dividend, now the lower of 6% or the 10-year Treasury yield, they profit before a single dollar goes to the U.S. Treasury. In 2023, the Fed made around $58 billion in profit. Roughly $2 billion went directly to member banks. The rest, minus expenses, was transferred to the Treasury. But think about the mechanism that produced those profits. The Fed earns interest on the Treasury bonds it holds. And those bonds were purchased with money that cost the Fed nothing. A magical cycle. Create money for free, buy government debt, earn interest on that debt, distribute dividends to private shareholders, and hand the leftovers back to the government as if returning a favor. This is the quiet beauty of the design. The public sees the Fed returning billions to the Treasury and thinks, they're helping us. But the wealth transfer has already occurred, upstream, long before anything is handed back. The fact that the Fed sends the government some money is not generosity. It is accounting. It is optics. To understand the true cost of this system, trace the money as it flows from your labor to the banks. The Fed creates $500 billion from nothing and uses it to buy government bonds. The government spends that money into the economy, but it then owes $500 billion plus interest. Where does that interest come from? Taxes. Your taxes. The income tax you pay each April, the payroll tax deducted each month, the corporate taxes embedded in the prices of the things you buy, hundreds of billions flow each year from citizens to the Treasury, then from the Treasury to the Federal Reserve, then from the Federal Reserve to the banks that own it. You work, the system extracts, and the extraction never ends because the debt never ends. The Fed currently holds around $5 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds at an average interest rate of 2-3%. That means the government owes roughly $100 to $150 billion every year, just in interest to the Federal Reserve. And the source of that money is not wealth created by the banking system. It is wealth extracted from the public. The more you zoom out, the clearer the mechanism becomes. Since 1913, this system has transferred trillions of dollars from taxpayers to the banking sector. Not through theft, not through corruption, but through legality, through law, through a structure intentionally engineered to ensure that debt expands endlessly and interest payments flow upward eternally. And here's where everything snaps into focus. The national debt can never be fully repaid. Not theoretically, not mathematically, not structurally. The entire system depends on its survival. Every dollar in circulation originated as debt. When the Fed buys government bonds, it creates dollars. Those dollars become the money supply. Which means if the government repaid every bond, every dollar used to repay, it would disappear. The money supply would collapse to zero. No wages, no savings, no bank accounts, no economy. If debt is repaid, money dies. This is the deepest truth hidden beneath the surface, a truth so counterintuitive that even many economists refuse to confront it. Public debt is not a flaw of the system. It is the foundation of the system. The U.S. dollar exists because U.S. debt exists, and therefore the United States debt must never disappear. Interest compounds the trap even further. When the Fed creates $500 billion in principal, it does not create the $15 billion in interest that must be paid on that principal. That interest must be extracted from money already in circulation, which means someone else must borrow, creating more debt, which creates more interest, which requires more borrowing. A perpetual treadmill, a mathematical impossibility disguised as economic necessity. This is why the debt climbs every year, even in years of economic growth, even in years of rising tax revenue. This is why politicians cannot balance the budget. It is not incompetence, it is design. Balancing the budget is impossible in a system where the supply of money depends on the accumulation of debt. A balanced budget would starve the system of oxygen. History has repeatedly shown what happens when someone tries to break the cycle. Andrew Jackson eliminated the national debt in 1835, the only president in history to do so. But he also dismantled the central bank that created debt-based money. Within 2 years, the Panic of 1837 erupted a brutal depression triggered, in part, by the sudden contraction of credit when debt creation stopped. The lesson was clear. A debt-based system collapses when the debt disappears. Over a century later, John F. Kennedy attempted a similar break. In 1963, he signed Executive Order 11110, authorizing the Treasury to issue silver-backed United States notes, money created by the government, not borrowed from the Federal Reserve. It was a direct challenge to the Fed's monopoly. Within 5 months, Kennedy was dead. Lyndon Johnson quietly halted the notes. The experiment ended. The Federal Reserve's authority remained untouched. Similar patterns surround Abraham Lincoln with his greenbacks and James Garfield with his warnings about private control of money. Each one pushed against the structure. Each one met a violent end. Coincidence is a comfortable explanation, but history rarely moves in straight lines without someone pushing it. Which brings us back, finally, to the question most people cannot answer. If the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air, who do they owe it to? No one. They are the origin point of the currency. But the government owes the Fed. Taxpayers owe the Fed. And through a century-old legal structure, private banks profit endlessly from this arrangement. You hold debt in your wallet. You spend debt at the grocery store. You save debt in your bank account. And all of it traces back to a system designed not to liberate the public, but to bind it. And here's the part that unsettles people the most, not because it is dramatic, but because it is logical. If every dollar is born as debt, and if the debt can never be fully repaid without destroying the money supply, then what exactly is the endgame? What does it mean to live inside a system where money is not wealth but obligation, not value but a claim against future labor? It means the system requires someone to always owe. Someone must carry the burden so that the machine continues running. And in the United States, that someone is everyone, every worker, every taxpayer, every business owner, every future generation born into an economy where debt must expand or collapse. The monetary base is a treadmill. The speed increases every decade, and no one is allowed to step off. This is the quiet architecture of modern finance. Permanent debt, permanent interest, permanent transfer. And the mechanism behind it all, the Federal Reserve, operates with a kind of serene detachment, as if guiding the economy through noble stewardship rather than channeling trillions through a structure designed in 1913 by the most powerful bankers of the age. Every time a politician tells you the debt must grow, they are not lying. Every time they warn that default would destroy the system, they are not exaggerating. Every time they vote to raise the debt ceiling, they are not being irresponsible, they are fulfilling the obligation baked into the design. The national debt must rise because the money supply must rise. And the money supply must rise because the system collapses if it contracts. This is why the debt ceiling debates are political theater. Both sides know the truth. Refusing to raise the ceiling would cause an instant deflationary shock. Banks would freeze, markets would implode, payrolls would halt, the economy would suffocate. Debt expansion is not a choice. It is the lifeline. And yet the public is told to fear the debt as if it were some monstrous force created by government waste or irresponsible deficits. But the reality is stranger. The debt is the money. Without one, the other cannot exist. Follow this logic far enough, and you arrive at an uncomfortable conclusion. The Federal Reserve doesn't just influence the economy, it defines the boundaries of political possibility. No president can eliminate the debt. No Congress can fundamentally alter the system. The structure is self-perpetuating, because it is legally and mathematically locked into place. This explains why presidents who challenged that structure, Jackson, Lincoln, Garfield, Kennedy, met resistance far beyond the normal boundaries of political opposition. Each one sought to reassert the government's right to create money directly. Each one threatened the private banking monopoly that underpins the Federal Reserve, and each one's efforts ended abruptly, violently, or in catastrophe. These are not conspiracy theories, they are historical sequences. The causes behind them are debated, but the outcomes are unmistakable. Every attempt to weaken the banking structure failed, and the structure itself emerged stronger. Which brings us back to the core revelation. The Federal Reserve owes no one, but everyone owes the Federal Reserve. This is the pivot point where the illusion drops away. Because the question, who does the Fed owe, reveals the trick, it is like asking, who does the casino owe for the chips it creates? The casino creates chips for free, then exchanges them for real money, real labor, real wealth. The chips cost nothing. The gains cost everything. The Federal Reserve is the casino. The U.S. dollar is the chip. And the players, millions of citizens, are required to keep gambling, or else the game collapses. If the government ever attempted to repay the national debt in full, if, somehow, it collected all dollars through taxes and delivered them to the Fed, the dollars would vanish. They would be deleted from existence, and the economy would flatline. There would be no medium of exchange, no circulating currency, no functioning system. This is why the national debt climbed from a few billion in 1913 to 36 trillion today. Not because of war alone, not because of spending alone, but because the structure demands expansion. Inflation is not an accident, it is a requirement. Without it, the treadmill stops, and the system collapses under its own math. Even now, in the 21st century, the mechanism continues quietly, almost invisibly. When crises strike 2008, 2020, 2023, the Federal Reserve steps in, not with money it has, but with money it creates. And every intervention expands the system further. The balance sheet swells, the debt ceiling rises, the burden grows. And yet most people still believe the government prints money. They imagine stacks of bills rolling out of machines at the Bureau of Engraving. They imagine taxes funding federal spending. They imagine a world where money is created through effort or wealth. But money in the United States is created through debt. And the institution that controls that creation is a private banking cartel wrapped in a public costume. Which leads to a more disturbing truth. The Federal Reserve is not accountable to voters. It is not checked by elections. It is insulated from political change. Administrations rise and fall. Congress flips red and blue. Presidents come and go. But the Federal Reserve remains, guiding the monetary river beneath every policy, every law, every promise. This is why understanding the Federal Reserve is not just economics. It is power analysis. The Fed determines the cost of borrowing, the price of money, the expansion of credit, the survival of banks, the rise and fall of markets. And through the system of dividends and asset holdings, it transfers wealth upward in a way so subtle and so systemic that people don't notice the extraction, they only notice the inflation. You do not see the interest the government pays each year over $1 trillion, but you feel the prices at the grocery store. You do not see the $100, $150 billion the Fed collects in interest, but you feel the shrinking value of your savings. You do not see the transfer happening in Washington, but you feel the pressure in your monthly budget. This is the hidden drain, the invisible siphon, the quiet mechanism that slowly converts public wealth into private gain, using debt as the engine. And now, after more than a century, the system has matured into a form only its architects could have imagined. A nation where money is debt, debt is permanent, taxes are tribute, and the central bank is both creator and collector. A nation where the Federal Reserve owes nothing but owns the system. Once you understand that the Federal Reserve owes nothing but is owed by everyone, the entire structure of the modern economy begins to look different. Things that once seemed natural taxation, inflation, national debt, interest payments transform into mechanisms of a deeply engineered design, a design that has operated for over a century, transferring wealth upward through channels most people never see. Every paycheck you earn, every dollar you spend, every loan you take, is touched by a system whose original purpose was not public stability but private control. And although the Federal Reserve presents itself as a guardian of the economy, steadying inflation, protecting employment, guiding growth, it is ultimately accountable not to the public it influences, but to the system that created it. This is why, even when the economy crashes, the banks survive. It is why in every crisis, the Great Depression, the stagflation of the 1,970 seconds, the crash of 1,987, the dot-com collapse, the 2008 financial meltdown, the shutdowns of 2020, the Federal Reserve's first priority is always the same: protect the financial institutions at the core of the system, protect the shareholders, protect the banks. In 2008, when the financial system collapsed under its own greed, the Federal Reserve did not punish the banks. It rescued them. It created trillions. It bailed out institutions deemed too big to fail. Not with money it had, but with money it created out of thin air. The public suffered foreclosures, job losses, and the evaporation of savings. But the banks emerged larger, more powerful, more consolidated than before. History tells us, when the banking system fails, the Fed saves the banks. When the public fails, the Fed saves the system. The question few people ask is why? Why is the Federal Reserve structured to shield private banks at any cost? The answer is buried in the DNA of the system itself. The banks are not just clients of the Federal Reserve, they are its owners. And ownership shapes purpose. The Federal Reserve, at its core, is a machine built to protect the banking sector and ensure the permanent expansion of debt. This is why crises do not weaken it, they strengthen it. After 2008, the Fed gained more power. After 2020, even more. With each collapse, the public loses wealth, the economy becomes more dependent on the Fed, and the central banking structure tightens its grip over both government policy and private finance. And through it all, the national debt keeps climbing past 10 trillion, then 20, then 30, now 36 trillion, and rising because the system requires perpetual borrowing to survive. Debt is the oxygen, interest is the harvest. And the harvest is gathered quietly, invisibly, year after year. But here comes the most counterintuitive truth. If the national debt were ever paid off, even partially in a serious way, the entire economy would collapse. Not because of politics, not because of global instability, but because the money supply would shrink, dollars would vanish from circulation, banks would lose deposits, contracts would fall apart, businesses would suffocate, workers would be unpaid, the economy would freeze. The debt is the money is the debt. Cancel one, and you cancel the other. This is the secret few textbooks discuss. In a debt-based monetary system, the question is not whether the debt will grow, but how fast it must grow to prevent collapse. Debt is not a symptom, it is the system. And yet, every election cycle, politicians stand on stages and promise voters they will balance the budget, eliminate the deficit, reduce the debt. They never do. They cannot do it. Because to fulfill those promises would be to destroy the foundation they stand on. Their job is not to eliminate the debt. Their job is to manage the narrative. The truth is not taught in schools because it is not compatible with the image of economic freedom and democratic control. The truth does not inspire trust. The truth reveals the architecture beneath the surface. And the architecture tells us something even more unsettling. The Federal Reserve is not just a participant in the economy. It is the central node, the conductor, the hidden sovereign beneath the visible government. Congress debates budgets. Presidents sign bills. But the Federal Reserve determines the price of money, the availability of credit, the expansion of the money supply, and therefore the rhythm of the entire economic system. Understanding the Federal Reserve is understanding American power. And the question that started all of this, who does the Federal Reserve owe, is the key that unlocks the entire illusion. Because the Fed owes no one. Its money comes from nowhere. Its liabilities are abstract. Its authority is self-contained. It creates dollars the way a novelist creates characters through expression, not extraction, through decision, not effort. But the government, in contrast, owes the Federal Reserve, and the government collects taxes from you, and you pay those taxes with the money the Fed created. You are paying real labor, real time, real years of your life to repay the interest on money that was summoned from nothing. It is a perfect system. The banks create, the government borrows, the public repays, and the repayment never ends. So when you pull out a dollar bill and read the words Federal Reserve Note, you are holding an instrument of debt, an IOU that did not originate in the Treasury, but in a private cartel of banks whose power has grown so steadily, so quietly, that it now defines the American economic landscape. This is why the architects of the system insisted that the public never be taught the mechanics. Because once you understand them, the illusion fades. You see the hidden gears turning. You see how inflation becomes a tool, how debt becomes a lever, how monetary expansion becomes a form of soft extraction. You see how the national debt, presented as a burden on future generations, is actually the engine of a system that funds the very institutions that created it. You see why the banks never fail, why the system never shrinks, why the Federal Reserve becomes more powerful after every crisis. You see how the real flow of money moves not from government to people, but from people to government to banks. And once you see it, you cannot go back. Because now you understand that the Federal Reserve does not owe. It collects. It does not answer. It directs. It does not participate in the economy. It orchestrates it. And the public? The public pays. This is why the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 is not merely legislation. It is the quiet shift that turned the American financial system into a perpetual motion machine, one that converts debt into money, money into interest, interest into wealth, and wealth into power. A system where the creators of money hold no debt, and everyone else carries it. And so we return, for the final time, to the original question. If the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air, who do they owe? No one. Because they are not borrowing, they are creating. They are the source, not the debtor. But this answer alone misses the larger, deeper truth. The real question isn't whether the Fed owes anyone. The real question is, who owes the Fed and why? The United States government owes them, and through the government, you owe them because your taxes pay the interest on the debt the Fed creates. This is the linchpin that holds the entire edifice together. The Federal Reserve creates dollars at zero cost, lends them to the government, and then collects interest funded by the labor of millions of citizens. Interest that flows upward, year after year, decade after decade, into a banking architecture that has embedded itself into the very bloodstream of the American economy. And the most astonishing part? The system is designed so that the debt can never be repaid. Not because politicians lack discipline, not because the government is irresponsible, but because repaying the debt would erase the money supply. Every dollar is a product of debt. Remove the debt, and the dollars disappear. Debt is the origin. Debt is the fuel. Debt is the anchor. And interest, the quiet, relentless interest, is the harvest. When you look at a dollar bill, you are not looking at wealth. You are looking at evidence proof that the U.S. government owes the Federal Reserve and that you, directly or indirectly, will help pay the interest on that obligation. And this system, this perpetual motion machine of debt creation, interest extraction, and wealth transfer is owned by the very banks that dominate global finance: J.P. Morgan, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley. The institutions that have survived every crash, every recession, every crisis, not because they are resilient, but because the Federal Reserve ensures they cannot fail. The Fed is not owned by the government. The government is indebted to the Fed, and the Fed is owned structurally, legally, historically by private banks. This is why, when the economy collapses, bailout money flows upward. This is why, when markets panic, the Fed steps in with trillions. This is why, when inflation rises, the burden falls hardest on workers, never on the banking class. This is why the economy can burn, the public can suffer, but the banking system always survives and expands. Because the Federal Reserve is not designed to protect the public. It is designed to protect the system, and the system is designed to protect the banks. For over a century, the American people have been taught to believe the government controls the money supply. But the truth is the reverse. The money supply controls the government. And the entity that controls the money supply is not the Treasury, not Congress, not the President. It is the Federal Reserve, and by extension, the private banking cartel behind it. This is why presidents who challenged the system, Jackson, Lincoln, Garfield, Kennedy, encountered fierce resistance. Each tried, in different ways, to reclaim the power of money creation for the government. Each discovered that the real battle beneath American politics is not left versus right, or tax cuts versus spending, or government versus business. The real battle is over who controls the issuance of money. Control the money supply, and you control the economy. Control the economy, and you control the government. Control the government, and you control the nation. And for over 100 years, that control has not belonged to the American people. It has belonged to a small circle of private banks, operating behind a public facade, protected by law, guarded by complexity, shielded by public ignorance, and strengthened by every crisis that forces the government deeper into debt. This is why the national debt will never shrink. This is why inflation never stops. This is why debt-based money creates permanent dependence. This is why your taxes are never enough. This is why the system keeps expanding, because contraction is death and growth means survival. And this is why the question, who does the Fed owe, is so revealing. Because it exposes the illusion. It shows you the trick. It reveals the hidden architecture. The Fed creates money for free. The government borrows it. You pay interest on it. Banks profit from it. The debt grows forever, and the system never stops. Once you understand this, everything about the modern world becomes clearer. Why nations across the globe drown in debt. Why inflation quietly steals purchasing power. Why banks receive trillions during crises. Why governments seem helpless to control spending. Why prosperity feels like it slips further away. Why wealth concentrates at the top. Why ordinary people work harder each year and still fall behind. It's not incompetence. It's not mismanagement. It's not corruption, at least not in the way people imagine. It is structure. It is design. It is law. The Federal Reserve doesn't owe anyone, but everyone owes the system the Fed directs. Every dollar is a string. Every paycheck is a thread. Every tax payment is a contribution to an interest stream flowing upward. And the banks that own the Fed are the ultimate beneficiaries. The public believes the government runs the economy. But in truth, the economy runs the government. And the engine behind that economy is controlled by institutions no citizen ever voted for. The Federal Reserve is the most powerful institution in the United States, not because it prints money, but because it defines what money is. And once you understand this, the illusion dissolves. You see the real structure. You see who truly holds power. You see how the game is played. And for the first time, you understand that the question, who does the Fed owe, isn't just about money. It is about control. It is about sovereignty. It is about who rules the financial world and who serves it. If this shifts the way you see the economy, it's because you've stepped outside the illusion. The mechanics are no longer hidden. The system is no longer invisible. And the power behind the curtain is no longer anonymous. This is how America's money really works. This is who owns the system. And this is why the debt will never end.